Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. 30 years of blah, blah, blah. And where has that led us?
Welcome to Meaning It. Yesterday, in parallel to the COP, there was another important meeting where the CEOs of the UK's major media brands got together and they pledged to increase their coverage of the climate crisis. Sounds good, but what does this pledge really mean? To provide more of the same narrative? Or will they now use their extended coverage to move public opinion towards understanding what the real game is that's going on, the real game that caused the climate catastrophe? My guest this evening is the outspoken journalist and author Donnachadh McCarthy. He's a penetrating critic of the billionaire media, and he's also been a tireless environmental campaigner for over 2 decades, including more recently with Extinction Rebellion. But more surprisingly, perhaps, he's also been a politician. In fact, the former vice chair of the UK's Liberal Democrat Party. One concept I know he feels very strongly about is the Overton window. Here's a reminder of what exactly the Overton window is from the McKinnock Centre, which is where Joe Overton first came up with this important concept.
The Overton window is a model of policy change, and the Overton window describes one big thing. Ideas that are inside the Overton window are ideas that are politically safe. The public is ready to accept them. But ideas that are outside the Overton window are ideas that might be too radical for the public to accept. And any politician who supports ideas that are outside the Overton window today risks finding himself getting defeated in the next election. Anything that changes the public's perception of an idea can shift the Overton window. Things like think tanks, the media, entertainment, a crisis, or historical events. Anything that gets the idea out in the open so that it can be discussed and debated has the potential to shift the window. There's a common misperception about the Overton window, and that is that politicians themselves move the Overton window. That's backwards. What politicians are good at is detecting where the Overton window is and reacting to it at any point in time. The Overton window cannot tell you if a policy is good or bad. What the Overton window does is tell you what policies are on the verge of possibility.
So, Donnachadh, what makes you say that the media are climate wreckers? Maybe the worst climate wreckers. What's the media got to do with it?
Well, I would argue in any society, there are 4 pillars for the fossil fueled economy. Those 4 pillars are government, banks, civil society, business, and the media. And I would argue that all 4 pillars are important to the fossil fueled economy. And if we are to tackle it, the most important and powerful one of those 4 pillars is the media. Because the media are what gives social permission for the fossil fueled economy. It provides the social and political permission for government to act or not to act, and it provides the same permission for businesses. It is my theory, after 30 years of involvement as an activist, as a campaigner, as a politician, as a media person, as a writer, that the most important pillar we need to deal with is the media. It is my opinion that if we got the media on board globally, the global corporate media on board, the way they should be, as they were in Second World War, and this is more serious and more threatening than Second World War, that the other 3 pillars, banks, oil corporations and government, those 3 pillars would fall into line almost within a year. So therefore, I believe that this is the most important thing that we need to pay attention to. To the climate movement. And I'm arguing that we have left out the 4th pillar. We look to the media as supplicants. We beg them to give us coverage. We invite their reporters, but we never see them as a pillar of power in our society. And I would argue in Britain, and actually nearly any country in the world, they are the most powerful tool that we have ignored. And unless we actually, as a movement, redress that failure, we're not going to do it in time.
And how is this power expressed? How does it influence all these other groups?
Sure. Well, the media is referred to as the fourth estate for good reason, because actually they are the gatekeepers to the information that the public makes its opinion on, and shapes public opinion. Public opinion shapes how people vote. How people vote shapes governments. And to actually give you a taste of the power that they have, recently during the COVID emergency, Dominic Cummings was invited to give evidence to the Select Committee in Parliament. And he said one of the real problems with Boris Johnson was he didn't pay attention to the public, he didn't pay attention to his MPs, he didn't pay attention to his advisors. Who he paid 1,000% attention to, he said, was the editorials in the Mail, the Sun and the Telegraph. That's not me saying it, it is one of the highest advisors in our government. Now, if you think through the consequences of that, it means that the core source of power in our society is that media. Now, people talk about other media, social media, or the BBC, or independent media. But the power of the billionaire media in the United Kingdom is staggering, because they shape social media, and they also shape the coverage in the independent press and in the BBC. I have been on many BBC programs where what happens in the mornings, the producer comes in, opens up the billionaire tabloids and papers and says, what stories shall we cover today? Or they listen to, they read the paper, and then the questions are shaped by them. And so you will have, so for example, the media a couple of days ago in Loopy about planes, the media flying to the COP. This is the most important conference in history. It's the future of humanity is at stake. And what are we talking about? The private jets that went there, access for one person, and a croissant. Rather than actually, is the government actually tabling the measures that needed to save us? Have they got the credibility to us? Have they got the track record to deliver a successful COP? That isn't hardly ever being discussed because it's shaped by the tabloids who have an agenda that's significantly against taking action on climate.
Could you say something more about the billionaire press? Because you're talking here specifically about the UK ownership of the press, and this is going out to the world. Is this comparable in other countries, or could you explain a little bit more about the press here and also about what happens elsewhere?
Well, in the United Kingdom, around 70% of our newspapers are owned by 3 billionaires. All of them offshore and all of them right-wing, with a significant right-wing agenda. So that really is one of the most powerful political forces in the United Kingdom. But as you quite rightly say, this is not unique to the United Kingdom. Australia, 70% of the media is owned by 1 billionaire, Murdoch, in Australia. In the United States, you've got CNN's owned by billionaires, the newspapers in the New York Times owned by a billionaire family, the Washington Post is owned by a billionaire, and obviously Fox News and Wall Street Journal is owned by the Murdochs. But it is. I spoke to an international audience recently, and I said it's a systemic flaw in democracy, in that the elite 1% are nearly always able to buy the media, and they always do, because they actually are very aware that by owning the media, you control the Overton window of what is acceptable political debate in any society.
Could you say a bit more about the Overton window?
Sure. So the media will the Overton window in relation to the media and debate is that they will define the parameters of what's acceptable debate and what's not acceptable. So, for example, over the last 2 months, it's been unacceptable, really, to express support for Installation Britain's peaceful direct actions. So they shaped the Overton window that the media discussed it on. So the tabloids went, this is terrible, this is terrorism, this is awful, this is poor people can't get to work. Actually, quite often it was like one junction in London. There are 11,000 junctions in London. But you had the BBC ranting about it, you had the ITV ranting about it, you had the radio stations ranting about it, because that was the Overton window dictated by the editorials from the Sun, the Mail and the Telegraph. So that's how they control that narrative. Another way they control the narrative is that they have said very clearly in the United Kingdom that the Overton window on tackling climate change has to be not cost us anything, and it doesn't have to impact on people's ordinary lives. So Boris Johnson says, oh, I'm committed, we're 1 minute to midnight, but I'm not going to have any hair shirts. We're not going to impose on personal freedom or personal choice. So if you want to fly 10 times to Australia next year, we're not going to interfere with that. That's how the Overton window on climate is controlled in that way. But but internationally, so almost every country, every democracy you go to, most of them you'll find to a certain extent the media is owned by the 1%. And that has huge implications for climate, it has huge implications for democracy, it has huge implications for the left-right debate, human rights, workers' rights, environmental rights, etc.
You're saying, in effect, that the media is acting as a kind of PR agency, but there are actual PR agencies, and there are also think tanks that are really just masks for lobby groups.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about the media being the fourth pillar, I mean it in a holistic way. So when I talk about the media, I mean lobbying firms, I mean advertising agencies, I mean the broadcast media, the telephone media, the television media, but also obviously online media. So it's holistic. Yeah, and you're absolutely correct. There are billions being spent, but actually the relationship between the think tanks and the PR agencies and media is really, really tight. So, for example, the Policy Exchange were hired, we don't know by who, to produce a report on Extinction Rebellion.
The Policy Exchange is a well-known think tank.
It's a well-known right-wing think tank in the United Kingdom, whose funding is not transparent. So how it works is, let's say I'm an oil company, and I see Extinction Rebellion are becoming very successful. The first two rebellions were public emanation. It was swept the world with excitement. There was a really positive response to it. It was a party atmosphere. It was positive. It was colourful. It was different. It was dramatic, and it was impactful. So what do you do? If you are the oil industry, how do you deal with that? So one way of dealing with it is to hire somebody to produce a report saying that they're extremists and that they are allied to terrorism. And so a report was commissioned, we don't know by who, by the Policy Exchange, and they published that report, which was called Extremism Rebellion, and went on about how extreme we were, and it tried to make that implicit reference that we were allied to terrorism. And that's where the language of extremism, terrorism applied to Extinction Rebellion started, because that report was published, and because those think tanks have access to the right-wing media, it's like a nexus. So the Mail, the Telegraph, the Sun will always publish their works. But what makes me really angry is that the independent and other broadcast media also cover those reports, despite the fact that there is no clear funding about who is responsible for commissioning them. So that report was commissioned by, who wrote it was I can't remember his name right now, but he was a former senior policeman in the Metropolitan Police who was kicked out for corruption around the Stephen Lawrence case. He oversaw the spying on the family of that murdered young man, and for that he was thrown out of the police. And he was the person who commissioned to write this report, and nobody mentioned that in the coverage of the report. And the BBC broadcast that, the coverage of the findings of the report, and that, in my view, started the media frenzy that Extinction Rebellion are extremists and we're eco-terrorists. And that's how you frame the debate. And so that then goes into Parliament, and then Parliament, we have a Home Secretary who will respond to that language, will use that language, and then justify that to introduce punitive laws to crack down on peaceful climate protectors. That's how malign the system is. It's really chilling, and it's untransparent, and it should be illegal. Now, what I find really strange was that when we staged our first protest for Extinction Rebellion, when I got arrested outside the BBC around 2.5 years ago, when we met the senior management at the BBC, we did trying to lobby for the increased coverage of the climate emergency in proportion to the level of threat it poses to humanity, and for actually to be integrated into all aspects of the BBC's coverage. That was a normal lobbying conversation we would have, and we did have. However, the only issue that they got angry with us on, and I found very strange, was that the meeting was a week after the Policy Exchange report had been published and was covered in the media, including on the BBC Today programme. And I made a request. I said, this is a report smearing us, captured right across the media, and we had no opportunity to know who is smearing us, and you don't know who's smearing us. And for all we know, this could be Exxon or BP or Shell, who've hired a hitman to destroy us. And you're covering it without any accountability. And the request I made was, in future, could the BBC undertake not to broadcast reports from think tanks if the funding isn't transparent? So the response from the senior executive got angry. He said, absolutely no way are we going to do that. He got really wound up and angry. I was going, that's why? Why would a senior executive in BBC get so angry at somebody asking him a reasonable question in a democracy that you only broadcast stuff that's attributable? That you don't broadcast smear reports by anonymous sources attacking peaceful protests or peaceful groups or peaceful advocacy groups in civil society. That's, to my mind, being complicit in destruction of civil society, and that's not the role of the BBC. So first of all, I'd like to say that the BBC, I think, has improved significantly on its coverage of climate since Extinction Rebellion started protesting outside their offices and our rebellions happened. There's now a climate section on the front page of the BBC website, which wasn't there when we started, and they have improved. It's not perfect, but they haven't. It's better. So let's acknowledge that, and I think Extinction Rebellion needs to take a bow for that, for the pressure, because nobody was actually drawing attention to the lack of coverage by the BBC on the climate emergency, on which is an existential crisis for all of us, until we started doing that. And I think that's a success that we ought to say, great. However, on the wider issue of the BBC, of it, where it's getting worse, is the billionaire media, i.e. Murdoch, the Mail, the Murdoch, Rothermere and Barclay, who own the tabloids, they've had a clear agenda for around 20, 25, 30 years to destroy the BBC. Murdoch, it's one of Murdoch's top aims is to get rid of the BBC, replace it with Radio Times, replace it with Talk Radio, Talk TV, replace it with these newspapers. And he has, bit by bit, set out an agenda. I remember there was a speech given by James Murdoch at the television festival in Edinburgh around 8-9 years ago, where he laid out his demands. And one by one, those demands are being met. Cut the funding radically, cut the ability of the website to provide in-depth coverage, gradually restrict its ability to have wider coverage on politics, and it's extraordinary watching how it's happening. We now have a government that's basically was elected with the backing of Rupert Murdoch, and so therefore very clearly Boris has just appointed Nadine Dorries in charge of the culture department, and people in the BBC have seen the writing on the wall for 20 years, and they're terrified that at the next round that they will be abolished, because that's the intention. They'll probably sell off Channel 4 first to the billionaire class. So we'll lose that. And they've been very good at holding the government to account. And the writing's on the wall for the BBC, whether it's in 3, 4, 5 or 10 years, if we continue to have a Tory government. And well, we haven't, and that brings us to a point where we didn't really cover the power. We talked about the power of the media to set the Overton window. What we haven't really examined so far in this conversation is the political power, direct political power. And what I mean by that is, there hasn't been a general election won in the United Kingdom for nearly 50 years without the backing of Rupert Murdoch's papers. There hasn't been a referendum in the United Kingdom that the side that Rupert Murdoch backed hasn't won. And if you think through what that means, it actually means that's why Boris Johnson isn't our Prime Minister, he's our appointed Prime Minister. And he knows that if he actually pursues policies that are opposed by those three men, he'll be thrown out of office. It has happened in Australia, and this is very relevant to climate and Extinction Rebellion, because if you look at three of the leading carbon emitters are Australia, United Kingdom and America. Between them, a huge amount of the world's investments in fossil fuels come from those three countries, and a significant amount of the emissions. Australia, as I said, Murdoch has 70% of the media. He has thrown out 3 prime ministers because they started taking action on climate. Not just left-wing, centre-left prime ministers, but right-wing prime ministers. Turnbull started trying to take action in the last government on climate. And Murdoch came over, read the Riot Act to his newspapers, and they turned their guns on Turnbull for 10 days over the fact he was taking action on climate. 10 days. 10 days later, there was a coup within the governing Liberal Party. Turnbull was thrown out, and what I call the coalman Morrison was installed. The geopolitical implications of that are now reverberating to this day. Last week, the OECD met, and one of the biggest challenges they had was to actually name a phase-out date for coal, and to ban all new coal-powered power stations. An essential first step if we're going to get to net zero. The only thing they adopted was that they would ban the funding of foreign power stations. So there's no deadline for continuing to burn coal, burning coal, and there's no deadline or ban on building new power stations in their own countries. Who was the lead actor on that? Murdoch's appointed Prime Minister, Morrison from Australia. And that broke the momentum leading into COP. And so therefore, that is an example of how media power translates into political power, translates into global negotiations on climate. The same happened in America. Trump is a product of the Murdoch culture. And 10, 15 years ago, the Republican Party was pro-climate action, but based on market forces. And that's why the Kyoto Treaty, God, that must be, 25 years ago. The Kyoto Treaty was based on Republican principles of using carbon pricing. The world wanted to go down regulation, but America insisted on carbon pricing because it was a market mechanism that the Republican Party supported, supposedly. Of course, Clinton and Kyoto agreed that, and then, of course, the Republicans vetoed it in the Senate anyway. But it was a Republican mechanism. And what happened, John McCain, as presidential candidate, was pro-climate action. People forget this. The main presidential candidate for the Republican Party was pro-climate action. But Fox News and the Wall Street Journal went to war in coalition with the think tanks, with the PR agencies and with the oil corporations, and they made it impossible for any ambitious Republican to stand on a platform that included climate action. And that's how it led to Trump withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, led to massive slowdown in implementation of the Paris Agreement, led it into a wobble for around 3 or 4 years. The Overton window for Republicans had closed. They had turned it from a window open to market responses to climate is a farce. It's a commie plot. It's the socialist agenda taking over. It's going to bankrupt America. That sort of language, and he made it into a left-right culture war, which is a disaster, because what we need, of course, is left and right to unite to save us all. I feel very passionately that it's very important for those on the left or centre-left to actually reach out to the right and to try and bring them on board with this existential threat that we all face.
Another controversial idea from Donnachadh. To find out more what he means by this, and for more revelations, tune in tomorrow evening when Donnachadh and I continue our conversation. Until then, my thanks to Donnachadh. And here's a telling postscript. As if to confirm what Donnachadh has just said, the Mirror has now revealed what it claims is the real reason Boris Johnson needed to race back from the COP to London. It was to have dinner at an exclusive gentleman's club with the climate skeptic Charles Moore, Lord Moore, a journalist of the Daily Telegraph, and other colleagues from the same paper. After just warning world leaders it's 1 minute to midnight to prevent climate catastrophe, has the PM raced back to share his vision with these media influencers or to get his next instructions?